January 5th, 1942. Colditz Castle, Saxony. Snow lies thick across the courtyard, and the temperature outside the walls has fallen to minus 17 degrees. Inside the camp theater, a Dutch prisoner is halfway through a scene from a play nobody in the audience is really watching. Behind the stage, in the gloom beneath the boards, a 25-year-old British lieutenant named Airey Neave is buttoning himself into a uniform he has spent weeks building from a Polish tunic, cardboard, and paint scraped from a tin of scenery lacquer. His companion, a Dutch officer called Anthony Luteyn, checks his own disguise one last time. Both men are dressed as convincingly as two prisoners with almost no proper materials can manage as German officers. Somewhere above them, an audience of bored guards and equally bored prisoners is watching amateur theater in a room built on top of a hole that should not exist. The hole leads down into the guardhouse. It has taken months to cut, hidden beneath the stage, disguised so well that nobody patrolling the theater by day would ever notice the seams. Tonight, while a play distracts the room above, two men are going to drop through the floor of Colditz Castle, walk directly past armed sentries, and disappear into the night as though they belong there. It should not be possible. That is rather the point. Colditz was not just another prisoner of war camp. It was where the German High Command sent the ones who would not stop trying. Officers who had already broken out of other camps, officers judged too resourceful, too determined, too dangerous to be trusted anywhere less secure, were funneled into this one grim, beautiful 400-year-old fortress on a rock above the river Mulde. The Germans called it Sonderlager, a special camp, and they meant it as a boast. Escape from Colditz, the reasoning went, was simply not something that happened. By January 1942, that reasoning had held for the best part of 2 years. Hundreds of attempts had been made. Tunnels had been dug and discovered. Ropes had been woven from bed sheets. Men had tried squeezing through drain pipes, hiding in laundry baskets, posing as workmen, as orderlies, as each other. Nearly all of them had failed, and the ones that succeeded in getting a man outside the walls almost always ended the same way. Recapture within days, sometimes hours, and a return to the cells to start planning all over again. The Germans had grown almost fond of the ritual. Guards would applaud, half admiringly, when a particularly inventive attempt was uncovered. It had become a kind of theater in itself, a contest each side expected the other to keep playing, with the ending more or less assured. The castle itself did nothing to discourage this confidence. Colditz was a Gothic pile perched high above the river Mulde, some 25 miles south of Leipzig, its history stretching back to the 11th century as a hunting lodge, an asylum, and a political prison long before the war ever reached it. Its walls, in places, ran 7 feet thick. Every window looked out onto a drop, a courtyard, or a line of sight covered by a sentry. The Germans did not so much build security into Colditz as inherit it, and then reinforce what nature and centuries of stonework had already provided. To the men imprisoned there, it must have felt less like a camp and more like a geological fact, something to be endured rather than argued with. What Neave and Luteyn were attempting on that freezing January night was different. If it worked, it would not simply be another entry in the long ledger of failed schemes. It would be the first time a British officer walked out of the castle the Germans had built specifically to make that impossible, and made it all the way home. Nobody watching the play that evening believed it could be done. That disbelief, as much as any wall or searchlight, was the thing Neave was counting on. Above them, in the theater proper, the audience shifted in their seats, unaware that the floorboards beneath the makeshift stage had been quietly, patiently cut and disguised over many weeks by men with almost nothing to work with but time. A German officer in the front row might glance up at the actors and think nothing more of the evening than a welcome break from routine. He had no reason to imagine that directly beneath his polished boots, 2 of his prisoners were dressed as his colleagues, waiting for the cue to move. It is a strange, almost theatrical irony that the very entertainment staged to keep bored men occupied became the mechanism of their escape. A small, dark joke at the expense of a regime that prided itself on order and vigilance. Neave was no stranger to failure by this point, and it is worth pausing on that, because the story of this escape is inseparable from the story of the ones that came before it. He had already tried and been caught. He had already stood before mocking guards in a uniform so poorly made that it glowed green under floodlight, an image absurd enough to draw laughter from the very men guarding him. That he was prepared to try again, in the same camp, under the same watchful eyes, tells you something about the particular stubbornness that Colditz seemed to breed in its most determined inmates. Failure here was simply data. It told you what to fix, not whether to stop. To understand why this mattered so much, you have to understand what a prisoner of war camp was actually for, beyond simply holding men. Colditz existed because the ordinary system of imprisonment had failed to contain a certain kind of officer. Most POW camps relied on distance, boredom, and the sheer improbability of a successful escape to keep men in place. Barbed wire, watchtowers, roll calls, twice a day. For the majority of prisoners, that was more than enough. But scattered through the camps of occupied Europe was a smaller population who simply would not accept captivity as a permanent condition and who kept finding ways out. The Germans' response was to concentrate this population in one place they judged unbreakable. Colditz sat on a sheer outcrop of rock, its walls in places 7 feet thick, its approaches overlooked from every angle, its garrison a full battalion for a prisoner population that peaked at around 800 men. It was ringed with wire, floodlit at night, patrolled continuously, and surrounded by a hostile civilian population many miles from any neutral border. Even if a man got outside the walls, Switzerland lay some 400 miles away across territory crawling with checkpoints, and every escaped prisoner was a wanted man the moment the morning roll call came up short. Neave himself had already tested the limits of the possible and failed. In August 1941, he had made his first attempt, dressed in a homemade German NCO's uniform stitched together from a captured Polish tunic, with a belt fashioned from cardboard and painted silver. Under ordinary light, it might have passed a glance. Under the camp's searchlights, the paint turned a lurid, unmistakable green, and he was picked out within moments. He wrote afterwards that he had become convinced the only realistic way out of Colditz was to walk out disguised as one of his captors in full view, rather than to sneak out through drains or tunnels in the dark. It was a conviction born directly out of failure, and it demanded a level of nerve that most escape plans did not require. A tunnel, if discovered, meant a spell in the cells. A disguise, discovered at the wrong moment, meant walking up to armed men and gambling that they would not look too closely. The challenge, then, was not simply mechanical, it was psychological, on both sides of the wall. The Germans had convinced themselves, and largely convinced the world, that Colditz could not be beaten. Any plan that hoped to succeed had to overcome not just locks, wire, and searchlights, but that settled expectation itself, the assumption in every guard's mind that nobody walking past him in a German uniform could possibly be anything other than a German. The plan that finally worked was built, like most successful Colditz escapes, out of patience and cooperation rather than any single stroke of genius. Neave had the idea and the nerve, but he needed the camp's escape organization behind him, the unofficial committee of prisoners who pooled resources, controlled who attempted what and when, and quietly ran what amounted to a small industrial operation inside the castle walls. Forgers copied German identity papers by hand, working from documents smuggled in or glimpsed briefly and memorized. Tailors, using materials begged, stolen, or bartered from guards, cut down old uniforms and civilian clothing into passable German officers' dress. Every item, from cap badges to travel permits, had to withstand close inspection by railway police and checkpoint guards who saw the real thing every day of their working lives. the scale of this hidden workshop is easy to underestimate. Somewhere within the castle, prisoners maintained what was effectively a small print shop and tailoring department, disguised in ordinary living quarters, dismantled and hidden whenever a search was announced. Ink was mixed from whatever pigments could be scrounged. Rubber stamps were carved by hand from boot heels and shaped to match German originals studied for hours beforehand. A misplaced eagle, a wrongly angled swastika, a stamp of the wrong shade of purple, any of these could be the difference between a routine nod from a checkpoint guard and immediate arrest. The men doing this work were not trained printers or tailors. They were soldiers, airmen, and officers who had taught themselves a trade under threat of the cells because the alternative was simply waiting out the war behind Colditz's walls. The escape route itself relied on a discovery the prisoners had made and kept secret for months: a disused space beneath the stage of the camp theater, connecting down towards the area of the guardhouse. Cutting through to it and disguising the entrance so thoroughly that it survived repeated German searches was itself a feat of quiet engineering, carried out in stolen minutes between rehearsals and performances, the noise of hammering and sawing masked by the players rehearsing lines above. The theater gave the plan its cover twice over, once as a physical route out of the building, and once as a genuine distraction, since guards attending a performance were, for an hour or two, guards not watching quite so closely. The trapdoor itself, once finished, was small enough to pass beneath the notice of the stagehands and disguised well enough to survive routine German inspections of the building, a piece of joinery good enough to fool men whose job was specifically to look for exactly this sort of thing. On the night itself, the mechanics were almost absurdly simple by comparison with the months of preparation behind them. Neave and Luteyn, dressed as German officers, dropped through the hole beneath the stage into the area around the guardhouse. Rather than skulking in shadow, they walked, upright and unhurried, directly past sentries who had no reason to challenge two officers moving with obvious purpose and authority. It was a piece of theater in the truest sense, performed for an audience of armed men who had been trained their whole careers to defer to the uniform rather than question the face beneath the cap. Once outside the perimeter, the disguise's job was done, and the escape became a race against time and weather. Traveling first by train from the local station towards Leipzig, then on through Ulm, the two men pressed southwest across a landscape blanketed in snow and patrolled by police who stopped and questioned travelers as a matter of routine. Neave later described enduring temperatures of -17 degrees, being tracked at points by dogs, and being stopped and questioned by German railway police. Moments in which a single wrong answer, a badly forged stamp, or an ill-fitting collar could have ended everything. They pressed on regardless, on foot where trains were too dangerous, navigating by instinct and nerve towards the Swiss frontier near the town of Singen. They crossed into Switzerland on January 9, 1942, 4 days after slipping through the floor of the theater, half-starved and exhausted but free. If you're finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know, because there is a great deal more to this story than 4 days in the snow. Switzerland was not the end of the journey home, only the end of German territory. From there, Neave made his way down through occupied and unoccupied France, over the Pyrenees into Spain, and on through Gibraltar, arriving back in England in the spring of 1942, roughly 4 months after stepping off the stage into the dark. He had become the first British officer to make what the prisoners called a home run from Colditz. Not merely escaping the castle, but making it all the way back to Britain. The Dutch had already managed similar feats earlier in the war, and it was in some part their example and their expertise that shaped Neave's own approach. But for the British contingent at Colditz, watching their own countrymen achieve what so many attempts had failed to do, the psychological effect was immediate and enormous. The camp's guards, who had staked no small amount of pride on the castle's reputation, were left to explain how 2 men in painted cardboard and stolen cloth had walked straight past them. Compare this with the German record on escape during the same period, and the contrast becomes sharper still. German prisoners held in Britain and Canada made comparatively few attempts to break out and get all the way home, hampered less by the security of their camps than by geography. An escaped German prisoner in Britain had nowhere friendly to run to, surrounded by sea on every side. The most celebrated exception, a Luftwaffe pilot who slipped out of a Canadian camp and made his way home via the still neutral United States, achieved his own kind of fame precisely because it happened so rarely. The Americans, entering the war later and inheriting much of the British and German experience of camp security, built their own systems around the lessons both sides had already learned the hard way, that walls and wire alone were never quite enough against a sufficiently determined and well-organized prisoner. What set the Colditz escapes apart, and Neave's most of all, was the sheer density of ingenuity packed into one small, overcrowded castle. Nowhere else in the war did quite so many resourceful, stubborn men spend quite so long confined together, pooling skill and patience against a single fixed target. The forgers, the tailors, the engineers who found and exploited the gap beneath the theater stage were not soldiers trained for this work. They built an underground industry of escape from nothing, using materials meant for parcels and Red Cross deliveries, because the alternative was to accept that the Germans were right about the castle being unbeatable. The material impact of any single escape was, in truth, modest. 1 or 2 men reaching Switzerland changed nothing about the balance of the war. What changed was something harder to measure and arguably more important: the belief, on both sides of the wall, in what was and was not possible. For the prisoners left behind at Colditz, Neave's escape was proof that the system could be beaten, a fact worth more to morale than any Red Cross parcel. For the Germans, it was an embarrassment that undercut the very premise on which the camp had been built, and it fed directly into an ever-tightening and ever more exhausting cycle of searches, countermeasures, and suspicion that consumed guard resources for the rest of the war. Records of exactly how the German command reassessed security in the weeks that followed are incomplete, scattered through wartime archives rather than preserved as a single tidy account, and historians are careful to note where detail fades into inference. What is well documented is Neave's own escape report, filed with British intelligence on his return, describing the cold, the dogs, and the fear of the railway police in his own words. That document, along with the camp plans he later helped compile for the War Office, still survives in the National Archives at Kew, a first-hand record of 4 days that very nearly did not happen. Neave did not simply go home and stay there. Recruited into MI9, the branch of British intelligence dedicated to helping trapped and downed servicemen escape occupied Europe, he spent the rest of the war turning his own hard-won experience into a system for others. The escape lines he helped organize and supply, threading through France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, are credited with helping several thousand Allied airmen and soldiers make it home. In a very direct sense, the lessons cut into a hidden trapdoor beneath a Colditz stage went on to save the lives of men who never set foot in the castle at all. Colditz itself still stands above the River Mulde, and the theater, the trapdoor, and the route Neave and Luteyn took that January night can still be traced by visitors today. The castle, now a museum and youth hostel rather than a prison, its walls no longer needing to hold anyone in. There is a particular kind of legacy that does not show up in casualty figures or campaign maps, and Neave's escape belongs firmly to that category. It changed how one man thought about captivity, and then, through MI9, it changed how an entire organization approached the business of getting people out of occupied territory. The forged papers, the study of guard routines, the understanding that confidence and correct paperwork could carry a man further than any tunnel, all of it fed directly into the machinery that later helped thousands of downed airmen slip back across borders they were never meant to cross again. It is difficult to put a precise number on how many of those later successes trace their method, however indirectly, back to 4 days in the snow between Colditz and Switzerland. But the line of influence is there, documented in the same archives that hold Neave's own escape report. Return for a moment to that theater, to the cold beneath the stage, to 2 men buttoning themselves into uniforms made from paint and cardboard and nerve. Everything about the plan should have failed. The uniforms were imperfect. The papers were forged by hand. The route depended on a hole in a floor that any thorough search should have found months before. And yet it worked, not because the Germans were careless, but because nobody on either side of the wall truly believed it could be done. That disbelief was the last and strongest wall around Colditz, stronger than the stone, stronger than the wire, and it was the one wall the guards never thought to reinforce. What Neave and Luteyn achieved in the space of 4 days, in temperatures cold enough to kill a man who stopped moving, was not simply a walk to the Swiss border. It was proof that a fortress built on the idea of its own invincibility carries the seeds of its own defeat, because the moment someone stops believing the walls are absolute, the walls start to matter rather less than the people willing to test them. Colditz was meant to be the place where hope went to be quietly extinguished. Instead, on a freezing night in January 1942, it became the place where 2 men in painted cardboard uniforms proved that hope, patiently and carefully engineered, could still find its way through a hole in a theater floor. Nobody believed the escape would work.